The little girl sat watching the television with her legs spread out in front of her. Inside the heavy and aged TV set, Alice was wandering through a bruise-coloured forest. She was crying because that sadist cat hadn't provided any sort of coherent direction. She was finally realising just how lost she was. The little girl in front of the television remained unaffected. She had probably seen the story play out 50 times. She knew things got better. Already the ducks like bicycle horns were gathered around Alice, shedding tears for her. You'd be hard-pressed to find people as empathetic as those bicycle horn ducks outside of Wonderland. The place where the girl sat and the man stood behind her was about as far away from Wonderland as one could get. The apartment was the second floor of a duplex, part of a house buried in a basin of woodlands deep in what many people consider vacation country. The woman was supposed to be there. The ground floor was vacant and sagging dangerously into the marsh around it. Twain was once in that same basin, but only in passing. The house hadn't been built then. By the time it had, Faulkner was in the hills to the south visiting relatives. There were no Hatfields and McCoys in the basin. There were no large-scale complexes even by small-town standards. The basin was a dead space. There were simply people who wanted to be forgotten, or people who wanted peace and quiet, and ended up forgotten anyway. Quiet has that effect on people. Out of sight, out of mind. Sometimes out of one's own mind if they think too hard about it. Sometimes if they don't think about it at all. The man watching the girl was tall and blonde, and had on a tweed jacket. 8 hours ago, he had started looking for the house in the basin without a clue as to how to find it. He had driven mile after mile of roads that had never been paved properly, if at all. He had no address, just a car to look for. As it got dark, he had used the mag light from the glove box to scan the sickly yet dense forest. After a hazy night of driving with heart pumping and a strange radio station fading in and out, he had spotted it. A wrinkled car with a collage of peeling off-colour bumper stickers. He had driven his Pontiac with heavy eyes and a heavier heart. He had stopped for gas twice. He had been at a pub before that, a well-lit and respectable saloon with good food. Then he had overheard a conversation, and now he was in the basin. He had driven back and forth the entire night. Around the early grey of dawn he found himself in Edenton once again. That meant he had gone too far. Edenton was a town in the heart of nowhere, but real isolationists fringed the heart of such places, and they lived in castles such as this. The man brushed his wet hair out of his face with one cold, gloved hand. He shivered as more rainwater trickled down his collar. A downpour had started just before he had found his destination. He had noticed on his way in that the water levels were dangerously close to the sagging foundation of the house. The man was almost saddened by the fact the house hadn't sunk into the swamp long ago. Various bits of stone and rotting plywood had marked the path to the stairs into the apartment and were already starting to be overtaken. He wondered if his car was high enough above the rising water level to be spared the flood. The way back home would be washed out in some areas. The drive back to the city would be agonisingly slow. At times such as this, the man wished he still smoked. He turned his head away from the girl and looked towards the uncovered dining room table. Amongst the fallout of garbage that littered it, cereal bowls, statuettes, overturned vases, and the like, a pack of off-brand Indian cigarettes sat open. Its hand actually reached for them for half a moment, then fell back to his side. He turned back to the girl. Health 101 courses he thought he had forgotten crawled up from the bottom of his memories. Side stream smoke, second-hand smoke, asthma. The man took off his gloves and tucked them into a back pocket. Unsure what to do with his hands, he wrung them slowly. The motion was reassuring and helped blood flow back into his half-numbed fingers. Sprawled out as she was, the little girl did not notice. Nor did she have time for such grown-up worries as to where to rest her hands. She simply sat there as any other toddler would, transfixed by the images on the screen. Yet this man, a stranger to her, stood staring at her in much the same way. The child was beautiful. Her hair was naturally the same colour so many other women strive for using bleach and peroxide. While tangled now, it was naturally straight. Her dress was a red pseudo-velvet thing any 4-year-old girl would think was pretty. Unbidden, The possibility that the girl could have been naked when he had walked in flashed across his mind. He'd have felt monstrously unclean if he had come in unannounced and found the baby unclothed. For the fake velvet dress, the man was grateful. He knew the skinny child's situation, and he knew that kids had a tendency to remove their clothes. Clothes are uncomfortable, and children have no reservations about nudity. There's no need for shame when innocence has precedence. No need for knowledge where there's innocence. Wasn't it Eve who screwed everyone over with that? He asked himself, his head thick with lack of sleep. No, a snake. A garter snake screwed over the totality of mankind's existence to wallow in places such as this. You'd think that the first woman would have questioned a talking snake. The man didn't remember reading about the other animals of Genesis talking. He did, however, think that any sort of talking reptile would cause him to walk quickly in the opposite direction. As it was, he didn't know any talking animals, and for this he was suddenly and stupidly grateful. Then again, if a talking snake had approached the small girl, she would have gladly carried on a conversation with it. She would have questioned it no more than Alice questioned the shape-shifting of the Cheshire cat. That was both the blessing and curse of knowledge. The man took a hesitant step forward, not wanting to interrupt the little girl any more than he wanted to pollute her lungs. He was the adult here, and children were supposedly better seen than heard. Yet he was paralysed by the sight of the girl in front of the old television set with the VCR wiring. Christ, he thought, do VHS tapes still exist? Apparently they did. His second sloshy step was not so stealthy as first. The unpolished hardwood creaked under him. The little girl looked around, first left, then right to gaze up at him, a tall strange man violating the sanctity of her home. The man wondered if she would scream or cry. It never occurred to him she might do neither. The curiosity of the innocent prevailed. The concept of a stranger didn't register with the poor angel. She raised one tiny hand and waved, her fingers curling inward and then extending outwards in rapid succession. "Hi," she said.
Hi.
He replied in a voice that cracked almost as high as hers. "I'm Sophia," she said.
I know.
And he did, more than she could comprehend, more than he himself had when he walked into the pub the night prior. He swallowed. His voice had almost cracked. She looked just like her mother. She had none of his pockmarked complexion. Her skinny frame might have been from him, but he had a feeling there were more unsavoury reasons behind her appearance. "You know?" she shrieked. Little girls did that, he guessed. She brought both hands to her mouth, now fully lined with baby teeth. Her tiny hands could not hold back the size of that grin. The man smiled at her in turn. His was thin-lipped, genuine and strained. He nodded jerkily. "Who are you?" she asked from behind those tiny soft hands. Only it came out more like a "Who are you?" in her slurred little child speech.
I'm Trevor.
He replied. She knew his name now. He felt his stomach clench. Sophia said nothing. She seemed to be trying to consume her own face with those soft little hands. Then Alice said something on the television and she turned back to the film, her attention stolen from him in an instant. He looked down at her yet again. After a moment's pause, he stepped through the crooked archway from the kitchen to the living room. Toys were scattered about like bits of fallen soldiers after a mortar strike. Trevor stepped carefully around a few of the toys, hardly noticing that he was doing it. His eyes were fixed on the little girl who was still fixed on Alice. He came to a stop near a tilted recliner, began to sit down in it, then reconsidered and sank down to the floor. He rested his back against the chair and allowed his arms to settle on his knees, his hands dangling in between his legs. Men like playing cards were singing about painting the roses red, and Trevor's eyes absently followed them. His mind floated 1,000 miles, and 4 years back, out and away from where he was. Sophia wasn't around then. He couldn't quite grasp the concept of her not being around. It was strange given the fact that this was the only time he'd ever met her. He was a teacher up in the city now. He was one of the few people lucky to get a job, and one of the luckier people who got to stay close to their own hometown so soon under graduate school. Life had gone on. He had started paying back his student loans. He spent his days trying to force kids to appreciate the real reasons behind the Civil War, and his evenings grading papers and eating pub fare. He had forgotten about the woman as gradually as he had forgotten anything else. It was only a one-night stand in the end. Years of sexual tension accumulating in one sweat-drenched pulsation of a night. There had been talk and feelings put forth that he wouldn't have usually shared as freely. He tried to call her 3 days later, ready to take a chance. It wasn't a booty call, and it wasn't a simple formality to ease his mind. He just wanted to buy her dinner, maybe see a movie. She hadn't picked up. He tried the day after, and the number had been disconnected. In the case of anyone else, he would have simply assumed that the woman wasn't interested, and he had left it at that. But he felt, despite his generally practical nature, that his connection with the woman had been more than just accumulated tension released and forgotten. He had loved her. Maybe it was that. The school teacher didn't know much about love. History was his field of study. Mostly he taught board juniors and seniors United States history, but he had also subbed for a few of the other teachers who were more prone to calling in sick. He wasn't a fan of most of them. He thought that if the state was going to tell the kids what to think and what to believe, it would be best conveyed through a non-biased medium. Most of the educators he knew weren't educating so much as indoctrinating. Of course, he emphasised everything on the state curriculum as required by the school board, and then counter-argued the points he was made to present. He cited documents, always backing up any historical fact with verifiable primary sources. As a researcher and as a teacher, he was skilled and clever. As a lover, he knew very little. Though he might have loved the woman, he couldn't tell. He'd wondered about her and had even missed her. Had her number not suddenly been disconnected, he would have called her even more. 4 years had passed before an overheard conversation had brought him to the outskirts of Edenton. The information had clutched at him like a drowning man dragging him into the depths. He had had to thrash viciously against the pole, and the only way he could have thought to do that was finding the woman. It was like a lucky break in a long-running police investigation with no leads. He didn't even know he had been searching. It was a metaphoric cold case. Trevor was sitting at his usual booth, dinner done, 1 drink and 6 papers down. The bar was close to the booth, and 2 men, not regulars, sat talking. The television above the bar was never that loud, and the jukebox was out for repairs, so it was hard not to overhear the strangers' conversation. They were not particularly disruptive, just drunk and loud. Trevor multitasked, the evolved form of a schoolboy doing his homework in front of the TV. Occasionally he glanced up at the reflective front windows to look at the men. The bartender tonight wasn't a bad guy, but was your typical alpha male type. He lumbered about the bar doing this task and that, and completely ignored the 2 who sat in front of him unless they requested a drink. The 2 men were loud and boastful, while the hardcore kids, football players and bouncers of the world established their dominance over all of masculinity. There are smaller competitions between different subgroups of males. These 2 were hippies, not your traditional flower power 60s boys, but the kind of beatnik looking, sunglasses 24/7 kids you saw playing their guitars on the subways and sitting in honest to God what is wrong with you people drum circles. Trevor didn't usually have a problem with hippies. He thought more logical arguments were needed than legalize it, but overall they were harmless. Picketing on campuses and chaining themselves to trees didn't affect Trevor's life. Hippies or not, the 2 men at the bar were acting like there were no brains and all hormones. The metaphoric cock-measuring contest was in full swing. The one with the Grateful Dead tee was bragging to the one with the red bandana. It was the same beat, same song, same dance. Trevor tried to focus on his papers. The conversation continued, whether he was paying attention or not. It droned in the background like a Seinfeld rerun. He was dimly aware of it, but not invested.
Like a cat. I'll show you the scratch marks later. She was absolutely insane.
Oh man.
I tell you, dude, those indie chicks are crazy. I went home with a chick just like her last week.
You pick her up at the same joint?
Yeah, same joints. Scrawny blonde. But she could grind like crazy. But there was something intense about it, you know? Like, she was on something. And when I say scrawny, I mean scrawny. Hot as hell, but young looking. Had this coked out Lolita thing going on.
Cool.
Yeah.
All three men took a drink of their respective beers before the orator continued.
So, we'd been chilling for a couple minutes. I was chugging my beer because the chick was exhausting. Hot, mind you, but exhausting. Every time I tried to go sit back down after a track was over, she'd start pulling at me. Hell, even clawing at me, going, just one more. So, having finally got her to sat down, sorta I mean, she was kinda pacing from the table to the wall and shit. Anyway, I was like, let's go back to my place. And she starts shaking her head like crazy.
Grateful Dead demonstrated.
So she does, nah, I'm not heading to your joint. Let's go back to my place. So I figure, what the hell? And say I'll drive. Then she starts shaking her head again. She does, nah, you follow. And like that, she's off like a shot. Bartender got one hell of a tip, and I only had to throw down a 20 before I went after her. I got outside just in time to see her get into this shit car of hers.
He finished his beer and raised his hand for another. Red Madonna was still working on his. Dead was picking up the pace.
So I'm totally buzzed, right? But I'm not about to give up on getting some ass. So I followed her. Yeah. Don't give me that look. I was careful, alright? Drove real decent like. The chick was doing okay too by the looks of it. She drove just within the speed limit. Calm as you please. Sure, her vehicle jerked left or right here and there, but overall it could have been worse. Honestly. But she didn't live anywhere close. She was like way out in the sticks. Like outside Edenton.
Red Bandana interjected.
Edenton? Bumfuck nowhere? Spooksville?
JD nodded severely, sloshing some beer onto the bar in his super. The bartender looked up from his phone, annoyed. Trevor was watching the men now, intrigued at how the raconteur suddenly seemed to be trying to get as drunk as he could as quickly as possible. His pace had increased considerably.
So, anyways, the car was easy to follow because there was this big ass pentagram on her back window. Almost took up the whole thing. I already said her car was a piece of shit. Maybe a station wagon? So it's just puttering along, and I'm...
Trevor's stomach dropped. The emblem sounded familiar. He put his hand up and approached the bar.
Another, Trevor?
Yes, and another of whatever those two are drinking.
The bartender looked over at him and didn't even pretend to hide his eye roll. Trevor pulled out his wallet and laid a bill on the bar. His papers lay forgotten on the booth behind him as he sat down next to Red Bandana. The hippies looked at him in his loose tie and dry-cleaned slacks, like he was something from another planet. Their concept for any sort of organised education was palpable. Trevor spurred the conversation forward.
Go on.
He said, in his head. Trevor was correcting Dead on every little detail. The car was a 1997 Chevy Cavalier. The paint job was a dark purple, and that's probably why you don't remember the colour. Could have been anything. Could have been black or midnight blue, but you didn't distinguish because you were sky high. Also, that was a 5-pointed star that was straight up, and therefore a pentacle, not a pentagram. The men stared, the beers came, and the schoolteacher smiled in what he hoped was a trusting way. Seizing his own drink, he waved the man on.
Continue your story.
Grateful Dead looked like someone had hit him with a wet swim noodle. Red Bandana's eyes narrowed with suspicion. They were both trying to tell if he was a cop or a lunatic. Evidently settling for lunatic. Grateful Dead continued.
Alright, so anyways, we get back to her place. Middle of the swamp, like I said. And she's like, we gotta be quiet. And I go, why? You got a boyfriend or something? All joking like, and she goes, no, I got a kid sleeping. So she rode me like crazy, man, but didn't say a fucking word, seriously. I expect her to be all mouth, you know, like she was at the club, but she fucked me quiet with her kid sleeping in the next room.
He bred laughter and his buddy joined him. Trevor did not. He was gripping his glass so hard that label was crinkling.
I tell you, man,
said Grateful Dead.
That kid was a whiny little brat too. Only like 4 or 3 years old. But she wakes me up at like 6 in the morning asking for her ma. And that bitch tells me to get out. I didn't argue. Looking around, I could see.
Dead stopped and looked over at Trevor. Trevor took another drink, his heart thudding, and looked away. Dead whispered to Red, but he wasn't nearly so quiet as he thought he was being.
Needles. And she wasn't no diabetic, man.
Shit, dude. You better get tested.
You think I don't know that?
Dead barked, his whispering forgotten. Whatever he said next was lost to Trevor. A sort of high-pitched whine was playing in his ears. Shell-shocked, he stood up slowly and backed away from the bar, as if he had just witnessed a stabbing. The whine only got louder. If the bartender or either of the men were paying him any mind, he didn't notice. Situational awareness was now a distant memory. He had lost all concept of situational awareness. It had after all been 4 years since they'd slept together, and then she disappeared. If the girl really was about 3 years old, as Grateful Dead had guessed, and if the woman he described was the woman Trevor once knew, he had driven all night in the area surrounding Edenton, and must have passed the actual location of the house at least 3 times, due to the pressing dark of the humid night. Finally, he glimpsed the vehicle through the trees in the early morning light. And so there he sat, now hugging his legs to his chest as he watched the girl. She didn't notice him because now Alice was 100 feet tall and giving the Queen of Hearts a proper tongue lashing. Sophia's face was a miniature of her mother's, a fragile porcelain double of half the scale. The way her lips curved, the way her nose was shaped, and the torrent of naturally bleached blonde hair was definitively the woman's. But the eyes, hazel circlets that seemed to dive into the black of the pupil, were his own. She was his. He suddenly felt a surge of anger towards the woman. He had never mistreated her, and he had never lied to her, so why had she disappeared with the girl? Was he to play no part in her growing up? Was he to have no knowledge of her at all? Was he deployed away mindless while she fucked strangers she picked up at clubs, and with her daughter, their daughter, sleeping so close? Blood filled his unshaven cheeks and pulsed behind his red-rimmed eyes. He felt too warm all of a sudden. Trevor stood up, removing his jacket and leaving it on the floor. He called her name. Sophia looked up, startled and wide-eyed. Trevor softened his tone and called out again. There was no answer. He turned to her, suddenly feeling guilty that he had interrupted the movie. He'd make it up to her later. Somehow.
Sophia, where's Mommy?
She looked at him with childish innocence behind those huge hazel eyes. Her facial expression was not stupid but pensive. It was as if the child were worried about something. After a few seconds, she shook her head. She's in the tub. She told me not to go in under any circumstances. Her eyes shifted left and right, as if she were worried about the wrong person. Maybe Mummy, overhearing what she was saying to the stranger. Sophia pointed down the hall that led away from the living room. Trevor took a step towards it and away from his daughter. The wallpaper was peeling in strips along the passage. Old wires with no frames hung suspended like branches from the places where pictures used to hang. At the end of the hall, light seeped out through cracks in a warped wooden door. Trevor resisted the urge to rush forward and kick the door in, screaming and cursing as he went. It would upset Sophia. He was not a naturally aggressive person, But this blasphemy, this isolation made it feel like a deformed child, padlocked in a shed. He had never done anything to hurt her, and damned it all. He didn't deserve to be shut out. He had not expected or even anticipated a child, but she was his, and she was there, and he had every right to take care of her and be in her life. He stepped gingerly behind Sophia and walked as slowly as he could manage down the matted carpet that so complemented the grotesque walls. The mother would have some kind of excuse, and Trevor wouldn't want to hear it, not after 4 years of solitude and silent betrayal. He would pursue sole custody. He would not have his daughter live in conditions like this. He finally reached the end of the hall, took a deep breath, then turned the broken doorknob. As the door swung open, Trevor had just enough time to think about how stupid it was for a woman who didn't want to be disturbed to leave every door in the house unlocked. When he saw her, he understood why. Her blonde hair hung about the face of a nightmare. Her full lips, the same lips that Sophia had, were now sunken into a gash of a mouth that gaped across her face. Inside that wound, a tongue hung limp about teeth that were either decayed or altogether absent. Her entire face seemed wrong somehow, screwed up into a twisted variation of what it had been. She was in a yellow baby doll dress that floated about her figure like some kind of aquatic weed. Only her emaciated head and arms hung limply out of the tub. The rest was submerged in the water that did not steam and hardly moved at all. The arm closest to him overshadowed a length of rubber tubing in the wet tile beneath it, and in the forearm, a syringe jutted out at such an angle it seemed to be accusing Trevor of something. Trevor let out a small shout of surprise and jerked his head away to avert his gaze. All the anger seemed to have leapt from his body. The woman wasn't there. She had been consumed by the thing with the red sores in the tub. The woman he loved had withered away into this cancerous maiden, but it was all that was left of her, and slowly Trevor forced himself to look at it. 2 eyes of indefinable colour rolled in their sockets to look at him. At first he thought it was a trick of the light. Then he noticed the very slight raise and fall of her chest. He brought one hand to his mouth and then found himself rolling up his sleeves, thinking wildly about carrying her out to the car and getting her to a hospital. He would bring Sophia and speed down the roads like a bat out of hell. He would be able to convince the woman to go into rehab, or... His thoughts were cut off by a faint voice like sandpaper raising from the tub.
What?
He whispered, his hands hovering just above the water. Trevor came closer, actually leaning over the tub, over the skeletal thing that was once his lover for a night, and his friend for longer. The mother sucked in a ragged breath with visible effort and spoke again. "She'll never know you," the thing rasped. Trevor jerked away as if he had been slapped, and stared at the creature from the side of the tub. The faintest smile, full of spite and mistrust, grimaced up at him, thin-lipped, cracked, and bleeding. Then Trevor saw red. He had never done anything to her, never deserved this isolation and suspicion. 1,000 men had hurt her, and she had objectified it in him while she fucked the rest. And then she took pity on herself like that, with a suicide attempt that was a deliberate sham. She'd surely left the doors open, hoping somewhere that someone would have saved her and take pity on her. From the needle, with a needle that was still half full with some kind of liquid, and a plunger that he was shoving deeper into her arm, pushing the plunger in. There was a shuddering gasp. The woman thrust her chest outward as if in sexual climax, her skeletal form raising out of the bath. There was an instant of anti-gravity, a weightless suspension over the water, and then she splashed back down. Trevor stood up and tried to leave, tried to get away from the corpse of... The wretch gasped. Trevor turned to look at her. Even now she was still breathing, without a single logical thought for what he was doing, without a care in the world save for one. He fell forward. One hand fell on the rotten face, while the other fell on the shriveled chest. The woman did not struggle much. Trevor only stood when the bubbles stopped coming up. This new guilt tried to tear at him, tried to consume him. If he hadn't killed her, she would have died soon anyway, he reasoned. He'd only quickened the pace of the inevitable. He hadn't done anything to deserve his ostracized place in her life. He He would be able to care for Sophia, like that poor excuse for a mother never could. He was still wet from the rain outside and filthy bath water. Trevor? Startled, he turned. Sophia stood behind him. She was illuminated by the sickly yellow light of the bathroom, and it made her look sick. Her eyes were large and upset. She glanced over her mother's head, lolling out of the tub, and guessed she was sleeping. Why are you crying? And in the empathetic way children have, she looked close to tears herself. Trevor swept her up into his arms.
I'm crying because I'm sad, Sophia. We might have to go away from here. Mommy is very sick and I need to call the ambulance to take care of her.
Sophia started to cry, not to bawl as children sometimes do, but to cry. He let her. It was his turn to take care of her, and despite what he told himself about what was moral and what was just, he waited nearly an hour before calling 911, just to make sure. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I would like to thank Alan's terrifying show, Ghostpaw Shadowclaw and TheCreepyChamp for helping me to narrate this story. They are great narrators. I'll leave links in the description below to each of their channels, so you can go and check out some of their amazing content. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. You can also leave a comment below. All feedback, good or otherwise, is always appreciated. If you have any creepy stories of your own, or have any topics that you would like me to cover, feel free to send them in via any of my social media. You can find all links to my social media in the description below. Until next time guys, make sure you lock your doors, stay safe, and I'll see you next video.